at the Republic of the Philippines.
The ninth session of the Senate, the second regular session of the 19th Congress is hereby called to order. Will be led today in prayer by distinguished colleague Senator Robin Hood Padilla.
A'udhu billahi minasyaitanir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Meron po tayong video na hiniram po natin kay Senator Loren Ligarda. Allahumma salli Allah Muhammadin Mustafa. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin Mustafa. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin Mustafa. Sa ngalan ng nag-iisang Diyos, ang mapagpala at ang mahabagin, kami po ay lumalapit po sa inyo gamit po ang panimula ng aming konstitusyon. Sa makapangyarihang makadiyos, humihingi po kami ng tulong sa makapangyarihang Diyos upang bumuo ng isang makatarungan at makataong lipunan na magtatatag ng isang pamahalaan na kakatawan sa aming mga mithiin at mga lunggatiin, magtataguyod ng kabutihan ng bawat isa, mangangalaga at magpapaunlad ng aming kamanahan, at titiyak para sa aming sarili at angkanang susunod ng mga biyaya ng kalayaan at demokrasya sa ilalim ng pananaig ng batas at ng pamahalaang puspos ng katotohanan, katarungan, kalayaan, pag-ibig, pagkakapantay-pantay at kapayapaan. Panginoong nag-iisa, tulungan niyo po kami na maisagawa ang aming mga tungkulin. Sa iyo lamang po manggagaling ang kapangyarihan upang ang konstitusyong ito ay maranasan at amin pong magawa para sa aming mga kababayan. Maraming salamat.
Secretary, please call the roll of members.
Roll call of members. The Honorable Senator Angara, Senator Binay, Senator Cayetano Alan, Senator Cayetano Pia, Senator De La Rosa, Senator Ejercito, Senator Escudero, Senator Estrada, Senator Gatchalian, Senator Go, Senator Ontiveros, Senator Lapid, Senator Legarda, Senator Marcos, Senator Padilla, Senator Pimentel, Senator Poe, Senator Revilla, Senator Tolentino, Senator Tulfo, Senator Villanueva, Senator Villar Cynthia, Senator Villar Mark, the Senate President.
With 21 senators present, the chair declares the presence of a quorum. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this juncture, may I be allowed to just acknowledge some guests from the gallery? We have with us the Royal Sultanate of Lanao, led by Sultan Ansari Maongko, guest of Senator Bato de la Rosa,
Assalamualaikum to my brothers in Mindanao.
guest of Senator Robin Hood Padilla, representatives of the Tiboli indigenous cultural communities from South Cotabato. We welcome all of them. Guests of this representation, Congresswoman Alexi Chutor, Christine Alexi Chutor of the 3rd District of Bohol, and board members. We also have with us Mayor Nelson Legacion of Naga City. Guest of Senator Gatchalian, Mayor Jesus Dureza Jr. of Hagonoy, Davao del Sur. Guest of Senator Bongo, Vice Mayor Joffred Nadal, Balagot of Buhi, Camarines Sur, together with Santa Isabel Buhi Barangay officials. Guest of Senator Tolentino, Mayor Brin Bakwaden of Besao Mount Province, Mayor Clark Ngaya of Barlig Mount Province, Mayor Constito Masweng of Tadyan Mountain Province. We welcome them, Mr. President, together with Nelly King and Company, guest of Senator Gatchalian, and also guest of our Senate President, Mayor Shin Shimura of Danbantayan, Cebu, Mayor Raul Herona of Tabuelan, Cebu, Mayor Alfonso Pestolante, San Remillo, Cebu, Mayor Joven Mandigo Jr., Medellin, Cebu, Mayor Mildred Lagbas Mondigo of Misamis Oriental, Mr. President. I hope that I'll get a better
Was
handwriting.
it because of the
Mr. President.
penmanship of your staff that you couldn't read their names?
Yeah, I hope I get a better penmanship.
To all
but
the
we welcome
visitors,
all of them,
yeah,
Mr.
to all
President.
all the visitors, welcome to your Senate, especially to the mayors that are here today, the Congress, our congressmen and women that are visiting the Senate. Welcome, welcome. We suspend session so that our colleagues
Yes, Mr.
can
President, may I ask for a
approach and
minute
greet
suspension?
the
Thank you, Mr.
guests. Thank
President.
you.
President, I move that we dispense with the reading of the journal of the 8th session, Tuesday, August 8, 2023, and consider the same as approved.
There be no objection to the motion. Motion is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this juncture, I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
There be no objection. We ask Secretary to proceed with the reference of business.
Bills on first reading, Senate Number 2393, mandating a master plan for flood management, increasing penalties for violations of environmental laws, appropriating funds, and for other purposes, Senator Tulfo.
To the Ministry of Public Works, Economic Affairs and Finance.
2394, declaring the maritime zones under the jurisdiction of the Republic of the Philippines, Senator Gatchalian.
To the Committee on Philippine Maritime and Admiralty Zones.
2395, establishing the archipelagic sea lanes in the Philippine archipelagic waters, prescribing the rights and obligations of foreign ships and aircraft, exercising the right of archipelagic sea lanes passage, Senator Gatchalian.
To the Special Committee on Philippine Maritime and Admiralty Zones and Committee on Foreign Relations.
2396, prohibiting discrimination, marginalization, and violence committed on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity or expression and providing penalties therefor, Senator Marcos.
To the Committee on Rules.
2397, adopting integrated coastal management as a national strategy for the holistic and sustainable management of coastal and related ecosystems and the resources therein, establishing the National Coastal Greenbelt Action Plan, other supporting mechanisms for implementation and providing funds therefor, Senator Estrada.
Ministry of Environment, Natural Resources, Waste and Means of Finance.
Resolutions, proposed Senate Resolution 728, directing the Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs to conduct an inquiry into the ruthless ambush of Apari Vice Mayor Romel Alameda and his 5 companions in Bagabag, Nueva Vizcaya, Senator De La Rosa.
Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs.
729, resolution requesting the Senate Committee on Public Services to conduct an investigation on ensuring aviation safety to avoid further accidents on air travel, Senator Tulfo.
To the Committee on Public Services.
730, directing the appropriate Senate committee to conduct an inquiry on the status of the implementation of RA 11861 or the Expanded Solo Parents Welfare Act with the end in view of ensuring that the support and assistance mandated by laws are being provided, Senator Go.
The Committee on Women and Children, Social Justice, Welfare and Rural Development. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, at this juncture, I move that we resume consideration of Senate Bill number 2034 under Committee Report number 62. This pertains to Reserve Officers Training Corps or the ROTC Act. So move, Mr. President.
There be no objection to the motion. Motion is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the parliamentary status of the measure is that we are in the period of interpellation. And with that, I move to resume the period of interpellation and recognize the sponsor, the distinguished gentleman from Bohol and Davao, Senator Ronald Bato de la Rosa, and to interpellate the distinguished gentleman from the great province of Sorsogon, Senator Francis Chis Escudero.
Our distinguished colleague, Senator Ronald Bato de la Rosa from the province of Bohol and Davao is recognized to sponsor the measure and to interpolate our distinguished colleague from Sorsogon, Senator Francis Escudero is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the distinguished chairman, Mr. President, the Honorable Senator Bato, yield to a few questions?
Yes, Mr. President. Thank you.
Mr. President, allow me to discuss first some policy considerations and principles behind the filing and if at all approval of this bill before I go into the details of the proposed bill. With your permission, Mr. President, Your Honor. May I ask, Mr. President, what is the main intention behind repealing the NSTP law and reimposing mandatory ROTC service for first and second year college students as proposed in the measure? What is the main reason, Mr. President?
The main reason, Mr. President, is that if I may borrow the words from the CHED, they said that the NSTP law is failing us. It fails to it is not producing the needed reserve force of the armed forces of the Philippines, and it fails to achieve its envisioned goal, which is to organize a national reserve corps that can be mobilized in times of disaster and calamities, Mr. President.
Mr. President, may I ask if this is contained in a formal CHED position paper, if there is a study backing that position stated by CHED that NSTP has failed, or it was merely stated during the subcommittee hearing?
They have provided documents, Mr. President. In fact, according to CHED, after the imposition of the NSTP law, there were already 6 million graduates of NSTP that were given serial numbers. But for all intents and purposes, Mr. President, they were never used or mobilized either nationally or locally during disaster and calamity response. So it is really a total disaster, the NSTP program. That's according to CHED.
Mr. President, is that the fault of the NSTP graduates, the program, or the administrators and bureaucrats who failed to utilize them?
Well, for one, Mr. President, pwede nating ibalik yung fault sa gobyerno because of the organization of this NSTP graduates, or we call them the National Service Corps, ay this very much disorganized, Mr. President. Supposed to be the government that will take charge of this is the OCD, Office of Civil Defense. But for some reasons, including local political reasons, hindi po ito na-implement ng husto at wala talaga. Unlike the graduates of ROTC, at any given time, they have standing ready reserve units that can be mobilized locally for any emergency, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Your Honor, I am a product of RA 7077 and also a product of the original National Defense Act, having taken both CAT in fourth year high school and CMT in my first and second year in college at the University of the Philippines. Up to today, Mr. President, Your Honor, I have not been called either. I have not been used, I have not been enlisted, my services have not been asked for any purpose. If by your definition that is the reason why you say NSTP is a failure, then wasn't ROTC a failure as well? If you look back, if that was in 1985, sino bang magaling sa math dito? Mga 15 plus 23, edi magka-40 anyos na yata yun. Na failure ang ROTC insofar as I am concerned, and I'm a living witness of that. Not to mention wasting all of my Saturdays under the sun and not learning anything, but I will go to that later. We're still here. So if it is a failure because nobody enlisted, nobody utilized them, nobody called upon them, the same is true with graduates of the ROTC under RA 7077 and even under the National Defense Act. Sa katunayan, I went through my ROTC. Kung maalala ko, nagpunta kami ng Fort Bonifacio, pinaputo kami ng 6 na rounds ng Armalite. And that's supposed to train me to defend my country? We were taught to march. We were taught to stand. We were taught to carry yung mga garan at that time. I didn't feel like I was equipped enough to defend my country because of those 2 years, once a week, every Saturday. So again, Mr. President, Your Honor, can the gentleman kindly, Mr. President, Your Honor, furnish me with a copy of a study, not merely the position of CHED, but a study upon which they are basing their statement that NSTP actually failed, because I have yet to actually see a study that says and evaluated and researched and reviewed NSTP that it is a failure based on the ground that nobody has been called upon actually using the NSTP program. And for the record, Mr. President, I'd like to state that the representative of CHED who attended the hearings is actually a graduate of the UP Vanguard. So biases aside, he would always be in favor of this. He would always be in favor of reinstituting the ROTC, having personal beliefs on this matter. So I ask that this representation, Mr. President, be furnished with a copy of a study, if one is at all available. Is there a study, may I ask? You have representatives from the AFP. Is there a study? Was a study ever conducted? Was a review ever conducted with respect to the inability, failure, or complete lack of substance and or effect of the NSTP?
Just based on records that they have, Mr. President, I am not well, I am the sponsor of this mission, so I am really for the reimposition of ROTC. But browsing the records, Mr. President, napakalaki po ang number ng graduates ng NSTP na talagang hindi nagagamit. Unlike the ROTC, I beg to disagree that uh, you also say that Mr. President, that the failure ang ROTC, maybe you were not a member of the ready reserve units of ROTC. That is why you were not mobilized during local calamities and disaster, Mr. President. Unlike my experience, if we want to share our own experiences, ako, yung buhay ko ay malaki pong naidulot sa ng ROTC sa buhay ko when it comes to discipline. At sa aking overall personality, Mr. President, kung mahinang klaseng tao ako ngayon, maybe that's because of ROTC. Basta I attribute to my whole being to my ROTC training before I entered the Philippine Military Academy.
Understood, Mr. President. Your Honor, we have various and varied experiences. That's why I'm asking for a study with respect to number one, the success or if at all failure of ROTC before NSTP, and a study, a review, findings based on evidence and fact that NSTP was indeed a failure. Because if I remember correctly, Mr. President, Your Honor, no study came out saying that NSTP is a failure. It was merely a statement of former President Duterte and a statement now of President Marcos and a statement of Vice President Sara Duterte that they want ROTC imposed to inculcate patriotism, nationalism, love for country, etc., etc. But I have yet to see a study based on facts and evidence that indeed it is a failure and indeed ROTC is better, because you have to remember, Mr. President, Your Honor, ROTC is still a part of NSTP. So if even the ROTC graduates were not called upon under NSTP, then ROTC is not the solution to replace NSTP, but perhaps the problem lies somewhere else, not in the program itself. Which leads me to my next question, Mr. President, Your Honor. Under NSTP, you can choose to go through ROTC in compliance with the NSTP law. Would that be correct, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President.
And according to the data I read, about 20% of those qualified or required to undergo NSTP actually took ROTC. So
Yes,
may I
Mr.
ask,
President.
since the enactment of the NSTP law in 2006, natawag ba yung mga ROTC na yan? Nagamit ba sila sa national defense, law enforcement, at saka sa disaster response? Because 20% of NSTP, Mr. President, Your Honor, undertook or took ROTC.
They were mobilized locally, Mr. President, lalong-lalo na yung mga membro ng Ready Reserve battalions, Ready Reserve units of the ROTC. Every time may emergency, sila po ang frontliner ng Armed Forces of the Philippines, aside from the regular units who responded to disasters and calamities. Sila po ay ginagamit, Mr. President. And I presume that they are products of the NSTP.
May we request, Mr. President, Your Honor, from the AFP, I presume, or the DND, data to the effect that indeed those who went through ROTC under the NSTP program were utilized, as stated by the good sponsor, in every locality of the country whenever there would be disasters.
Yes, Mr. President, I will, this representation will give you those documents.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Honor. Now, Mr. President, I have no doubt that those who are prepared to lay down their lives for the country, hindi lang ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo, pati ang pumatay ng dahil sa'yo, nag-uumapaw ang pagmamahal sa bayan. Di ba? Kasi hindi naman tayo dapat mamatay lang. Eh. Dapat, di ba? Handa rin tayo para pagtanggol ang kalayaan dahil sa pagmamahal sa bayan. But while I do not diminish it, Mr. President, you know, and in fact, I have high regard for it. Why does it seem like those who are not willing to take up arms are looked down upon as persons who do not love their country? Even our national hero did not raise a single sword or a single gun to defend his country and fight for his love for country. And yet he is our national hero. By saying that patriotism and nationalism can only be achieved and taught through ROTC is like saying that if you refuse to do so, then you most likely love your country less at the very least. What would the good sponsor say to that assertion?
Mr. President, our national hero, Dr. Jose Rizal, did not take up arms against the Spaniards, but he was killed by the Spaniard. So ultimately, he offered the ultimate sacrifice for this country. Hindi naman natin, I disagree with the saying that the people who doesn't support ROTC are unpatriotic. No, it doesn't follow all the time, Mr. President. Ang sa akin lang, if you are going to have an order or classification, siguro, masasabi ko, Mr. President, yung Pilipino na willing pumatay na mga invaders at magpakamatay in the name of the Filipino flag and the Filipino people and the Filipino nation, they are more patriotic than those sitting on the sides, waiting for what will happen, and will just benefit the fruits that the fruits that we harvest after the war or after the invasion, Mr. President. But it doesn't say that I don't say that they are not patriotic. Maybe in degree, they differ, Mr. President. Para sa akin, mas patriotic yung taong willing pumatay at magpakamatay in the name of the Filipino flag, Mr. President.
Admittedly, and I don't disagree with the good sponsor, Mr. President, Your Honor, I asked that question because the basic declaration of policy when NSTP was passed is almost verbatim with the basic declaration of policy with respect to this new bill, reimposing ROTC as mandatory, to inculcate patriotism, nationalism, love for country. Mention was also made with respect to disaster preparedness when the NSTP law was passed. The objective is actually the same. That's why NSTP included ROTC as one of the options, but not a mandatory imposition. By stating that ROTC is now going to be mandatory under the proposed bill, and by repealing expressly NSTP insofar as the other options are concerned, other than ROTC, it's like saying or conveying the message, Mr. President, Your Honor, that patriotism, nationalism, love for country, service for country can only be done through the ROTC program and not the other programs such as the literacy program, the community service program, by which they can show equally, with equal fervor, their love for country and patriotism.
Well, Mr. President, I subscribe that you can be patriotic while serving the CWTS or the Community Welfare Training Service or the Literacy Training Service. But Mr. President, remember, pagdating ng araw na tayo'y aatakihin ng China or whatever country atake sa atin, hindi po namimili ng babae o lalaki yung bala na paputukin ng kalaban. At pagdating po sa sakuna, disaster, at saka calamity, hindi po namimili ang calamity, ang baha, kung sinong mabubuhay o hindi, babae o lalaki ba. Kaya minabuti natin na lahat tayo ay disaster prepared, malalaki o mababae. At Mr. President, during the time yung old ROTC law was enacted, hindi pa po uso ang gender equality. Ngayon po, our women are always espousing for gender equality. So why not give them the opportunity to serve their country, to fight for this country if needed, Mr. President?
Actually, tutungo talaga ako sa puntong yan. Inunahan niyo lang ako ng konti. Nung nag-CMT ako, requirement at mandatory lamang ang CMT para sa mga lalaki. Ang layunin, ulitin ko, to inculcate patriotism, nationalism, love for country, etc., etc. Hindi ni-require yan sa mga babae. Ang dahilan ba ay mas maliit ang tingin ng gobyerno, ng kongreso, ng pamahalaan noon sa mga babaeng hindi kakayanin ng ROTC training? O ang tingin ba nila, hindi na kailangan mag-ROTC ng babae dahil mas mahal talaga nila kaysa lalaki ang bansa? Mas patriotic sila, mas nationalistic sila. What is the reason for the distinction at that time? Na bakit noon hindi sinasabay ang babae under the National Defense Act, under RA 7077, but now there is a push to include them already. What is the difference and what changed, Mr. President, Your Honor?
Most likely, Mr. President, maybe I was not yet born when the Congress was debating on that particular measure. But siguro na nangingibabaw yung pagmamahal ng Pilipino sa babae. Ay kung ako lang masunod, hindi ko pwedeng, I have a daughter. Alam ko, mahal na mahal ko yung anak ko. Ayaw ko silang mahirapan. Pero, Mr. President, worst comes to worst. Ang pagmamahal ko sa aking anak ay kailangan ipakita ko sa paghahanda nila sa kanilang future na pwede silang lumaban kung kinakailangan para depensahan yung ating bansa, Mr. President, at sila mabubuhay kapag mayroong calamity. They can survive during calamity, Mr. President. Siguro ang rason, as I have said, hindi popular yung gender equality during that time. Right now, gender equality is the norm of the day. Yan palaging sinasabi ng ating mga kababaihan. So, let's give them the benefit of serving this country, Mr. President.
So ang sinasabi po niyo, noong mga panahong yon, mas mahal ng mga tatay at magulang yung mga anak nilang babae kaysa sa anak nilang lalaki?
Mas siguro depende, the context is very, very different, Mr. President. We may be taking this issue out of context, but ngayon, mahal na mahal ko yung mga anak kong babae, but then again, I prodded them to become members of the reserve force of the Philippine Air Force because nakikita ko po yung sitwasyon na kapag tayo inatake dito, mga anak ko, walang alam kung paano depensahan yung sarili nila, much less our country. Kawawa tayo, Mr. President. So, ang pagmamahal ko sa kanila ay gusto kong ipakita na sigurado yung future nila. They can be safe. Kahit na wala na tayo dito sa mundong ibabaw, patay na tayo, they can stand their ground when it comes to invasion, Mr. President.
Personally, Mr. President, Your Honor, ayoko ng ROTC at hindi ako nasiyahan ng pinagdaanan ko yun. Pero, syempre, para mag-graduate, kailangan sumunod, kailangan sundin. Now, I believe gender equality is being used to offer this to women para yung pagkakataong meron ng lalaki, meron din ng babae. Yun po ang sinasabi ninyo?
Well,
Gender equality ka mo, hindi lang lalaki ngayon. Dapat pantay na, gender equality eh. I-require din natin ng babae, hindi lang ang lalaki. That's the premise. Is that correct, Mr. President, Your Honor?
Yes, Mr. President, kasama na rin yan.
Hindi. Yun ba yun? Hindi sa kasama yun. Sabi mo, gender, Mr. President, the sponsor said gender equality.
Yes.
What is made available to men should also be made available to women. That's what
Including,
gender equality
including,
basically
Your Honors, including LGBTQ.
They're women.
Everyone,
They're women.
everyone.
They're
May,
women or
may
men.
pelikula nga, Private Benjamin, di ba? Galing ni Vice ganda doon.
The point being, Mr. President, Your Honor, is usually gender equality, sexes discriminated upon would like equality with respect to the things and opportunities that they like. There is even no data that says women want that. There is even no data that says women want to be equal and at par with men with respect to being required to undergo ROTC. That may be the justification, Mr. President, when you say you're including women, but have you heard from the women themselves if they indeed want that or not?
My daughters, Mr. President, tinanong ko sila, gusto nila. May staff ng mga babae, gusto
Alam
nila.
nga namang sabihin sa'yo, hindi, author ka.
Hindi. I'm just being candid, Mr. President. I'm just being candid and honest to the good gentleman from Bicol that marami ring gusto talagang mag-ROTC. Kaya nga kung gusto natin makuha talaga yung opinion nila, we have already received surveys saying that 90% of Filipinos want ROTC to be reinstated. So that says, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Your Honor, can the good sponsor submit to this representation the data he's making mention of? Because the survey I read and saw asked men and women separately, but not by age group. Kasi ang binibigyan natin ng gender equality, yung 18 to 25 eh. Huwag natin pag-usapan yung mas
Maybe to help
matanda,
our
yung
good
mas
colleague
bata.
from Sorsogon, I believe Senator Sherwin Gatchalian asked Pulse Asia, no? You had a rider question. Maybe you can share it to the body, the results of that survey. That would be very interesting to find out.
Yes, Mr. President, the sponsor would like to ask reinforcement coming from my good friend, the good gentleman from Valenzuela. No, not China, Valenzuela.
Valenzuela, Mr. President. Okay, flash. Well, Mr. President, I'll flash it on the screen, but we commissioned Pulse Asia to do a rider survey dated March 15 to 19, 2023. And the question, Mr. President, how much do you agree or disagree with the proposal to implement ROTC in all students in college, to all students in college? And the ones who responded agree is 78%, and the one who responded disagree is 13%, Mr. President. So there's an overwhelming support from our constituents.
13%?
13%, Mr. President. The ones who cannot say is 8%, Mr. President.
Could you share with us the demographics of that? That's what Senator Escudero's asking. How many were the 18 to 21 bracket and the middle
25.
age and all that? It would be great to find out.
For Mr. President, for those who are in the 18 to 24 years old, the ones who agree is 75%, Mr. President. For 25 to 34 is 83%, Mr. President.
Maybe get a copy of the survey.
Yes, Mr. President, I can furnish the body with a copy of the survey,
Yes,
Mr.
please.
President.
Maybe get a copy, Mr. President, after the interpellation. Thank
I
you.
believe the sponsor of that survey said he will share it with the body.
Yes, Mr. President. Your Honor. Now, aside from gender equality, Mr. President, Your Honor, what is the purpose why we're including women now when we never included them before?
Mr. President, as I have said a while ago, pag tayo inatake ng kalaban, hindi po namimili ang bala. Kung ang tatamaan lang niya, lalaki. Kasama po ang mga babae, bata, matanda niya, tatamaan. That is why, dapat rin prepared tayo lahat, pati babae. At pag tumama ang bagyo, baha, earthquake, hindi po namimili yan ng babae at lalaki. So dapat tayo lahat ay prepared sa lahat ng klaseng calamity. So yan po ang naging ang rason, Mr. President, bakit kailangan natin ihanda ang lahat ng mamayang Pilipino sa lahat ng klaseng sakuna na darating.
Mr. President, just for the record, instead of asking the good sponsor, the National Defense Act was enacted in 1935 when we were a newly founded republic. A few years after that, less than a decade, World War II started. But our forefathers did not see it fit at that time to include both men and women insofar as compulsory military reserve military training is concerned. I believe we are farther from war today, given present world circumstances and politics, than we were in 1935, going into World War II, bearing in mind too, Mr. President, Your Honor, that the beginnings of World War II were already starting by 1935 when we became an independent, when we became a Commonwealth, and World War I just finished, at least in Europe at that time. Moving forward, Mr. President, Your Honor, the proposed bill has highfalutin objectives with respect to patriotism, nationalism, love for country, disaster preparedness, as the distinguished sponsor said, and yet there is no program of instruction that is already in place, or at least, at the very least, if this will be delegated, there should be some guidelines and guideposts as to what such program of instruction would entail. For example, Mr. President, Your Honor, mahirap na nga punuin yung ROTC at requirements ng ROTC insofar as the military aspect of it is concerned, which I participated in when I was in college for 2 years, at least every Saturday. Dinagdag pa yung police, dinagdag pa yung disaster preparedness, dinagdag pa yung civic mindedness. So may I ask, this program of instruction, what would it entail? Hindi naman pwedeng sabihin lang natin na ito yung objective, tapos pag gumawa ng program of instruction ang CHED, ang TESDA, ang DND, in the author's mind, in the sponsor's mind, what would consist of such program of instruction? How many times a week? How do you break it up? At hindi na ba tulad ng dati na puro marcha? Kasi pag sinabi ROTC, marcha, ilalim ng araw, konting lecture lang, tapos may bivouac. Meron ka ng disaster preparedness. May law enforcement ka. Meron ka pang love of country. How does the distinguished sponsor see this being implemented under the POI being recommended and or mandated?
Mr. President, it is clearly stated in Section 5 of the said measure that the basic ROTC program curriculum, the DND, CHED, and TISDA, in consultation with other relevant government agencies and private stakeholders, including associations of schools, shall design and formulate the program of instruction on the basic ROTC and be guided with the following purposes and objectives, which was cited by the good gentleman from Sorsogon. And Mr. President, we will be may kasama ditong provision for the creation of for a while, Mr. President. Section 25, Joint Congressional Oversight Committee. There is hereby created a Joint Congressional Oversight Committee to oversee, monitor, and evaluate the implementation of this act. The JCOC shall be composed of 5 members, each from the Senate and the House of Representatives, with the chairpersons of the committees on higher education. The good gentleman from Sorsogon is the chairman as far as this mission is concerned. On both houses and as co-chairpersons. So using this Joint Congressional Oversight Committee, Mr. President, we have to make sure that the objectives enumerated in this proposed measure be achieved through the implementation, Mr. President. So, sinasabi natin palagi that we in the legislature has no more role to play as far as the IRR is concerned, because it is the jurisdiction of the executive branch of government. But still, we can exercise our oversight function, Mr. President. And being the chairman, being the sponsor of this bill, I will see to it really that the aforecited objectives be achieved in the IRR that they are going to formulate and implement, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Section 25, for the record, and perhaps we can discuss this at a later time during the period of amendments, does not require that the Congressional Oversight Committee approve the POI. In fact, that has been one of the problems Congressional Oversight Committees have faced insofar as the implementation of certain laws that we passed. So perhaps at the proper time, we can specifically make mention that the Joint Congressional Oversight Committee, the JCOC on this, needs to approve the POI that will be drafted, because there won't be any rules really. It's more the POI. But at the proper time, Mr. President, I will make the proper motions to that effect. My question, Mr. President, is, again, this is clearly a delegation of legislative power to DND, CHED, and TESDA in consultation with private schools. So we have to give them some directions. Military and police training, consciousness in ethics of service, patriotism, nationalism, respect for human rights, appreciation of the role of national heroes in the historical development of the country, civic-mindedness, volunteerism, genuine service to others. So may I ask, can we at the very least, if not in the bill, during our debates now in the congressional records, which will form part of this bill when it becomes law as Congress's intent, how does the good sponsor envision what the POI will contain? Hindi naman porket ROTC na ang dami nating dinagdag, ni tulad ng dating ROTC. ROTC, yun na yun. So, if you're talking, inculcating all of these things in one Saturday morning every week for 2 years for all first and second year students or within their 4-year stay in college, how do you see the program going? At kung merong love for country, history, police training, civic-mindedness, volunteerism, ang fatigue nila isa lang. Tuwing pag-uusapan ba nila ang history, tuwing pag-uusapan ba nila ang love for country, o yung papel ng mga bayani natin, naka-uniforme pa rin sila. How does the good sponsor envision it happening? Because when we were doing it, we would always be required to wear a uniform. Sisigawan kami mula ulo hanggang paa para magmarcha, para mag-formation, para sumaludo, magbitbit ng baril, mag-about face, mag-left right, turn right. This one, how will it be different from what I experienced before and what my generation experienced before? Without going to the details, can the distinguished sponsor elucidate and enlighten us how he envisions this to be, the POI, the program of instruction?
Well, Mr. President, since they are taking up ROTC, they are required to wear that uniform, regardless of what subject they are going to undertake, whether it's about disaster, whether it's about love of country, patriotism, civic-mindedness, and etc., Mr. President, it is mandatory on their part to wear the uniform every time they go to formation, Mr. President. That's it. I don't see any reasons why it is bad to wear that uniform. That uniform represents the country. I don't think so that wearing that uniform is additional burden on the part of the students, because if you really love your country, you love everything that represents your country. You love the flag, you love the uniform, you love everything about your country, Mr. President.
I'm not saying it's bad, Mr. President, Your Honor, but it's also not wrong to bad my own, it's also not bad to love my own style whenever I'm studying, whenever I'm reading, and whenever I'm listening to my professors. But the point, Mr. President, is program of instruction. So, curriculum po ba itong bago? To teach all of these things provided here?
Yes, Mr. President, they will formulate a new curriculum that will respond to these objectives that we have enumerated here.
So since this is for 2 years, Mr. President, Your Honor, or 4 semesters, may I ask, how many units is this? Kung gagawa natin ng program of instruction, gagawa natin ng curriculum, ilang units po ba itong ROTC?
3 units, Mr. President.
3 units?
Yes, per semester.
And the class ROTC service training will be for how many hours? Every Saturday?
4 hours. 4 hours, Mr. President, every Saturday.
Mr. President, Your Honor, I think the good sponsor should look into again and consult the experts behind him. When you say 3 units, Mr. President, it usually means 3 hours per week. When you say 4 units, Mr. President, means 4 hours per week. You cannot have 4 hours and 3 units of credit, Mr. President, Your Honor. And this is significant because when we reach the later portions of this bill, the good sponsor made mention of 50% of the cost of 1 unit. So how many units this will be is actually relevant. So 3 or 4 units.
3 or 4 units. The AAP says it's 3 units, Mr. President.
So it should be 3 hours per week, not 4 hours. What's the basic hang-up with mentioning it, saying 4 units instead of 3 units and 4 hours? Again, common logic dictates that if it is 3 units, it's 3 hours per week. In all schools, they follow that. If it is 4 units, it's 4 hours per week. And if it's 3 units, then it's a total of 12 units for 2 years on top of the existing curriculum of a college student. If it's 4 units, it's an additional 16 units to the existing curriculum of all college students.
Mr. President, according to CHED, it's 60 training periods, meaning 60 training hours per semester, Mr. President. So,
60 training hours.
yes, 60 training hours per semester.
How do you divide that in days and number of, if it's once a week, how many weeks would be in one semester?
15 Saturdays, Mr. President, times 4. So 15 times 4, it's 60 training hours.
Ulitin ko po, Mr. President, Your Honor. Is there a representative of CHED here? Meron ba?
Wala, Mr. President, because meron
Akala ko
silang...
sabi ng sponsor according to CHED.
According to CHED, that's according to him, during the technical working
According
committee
to AFP,
discussion.
So according to AFP, CHED said.
Yes, Mr. President.
Yes,
That's-
but again, kahit kayo, sir, you in the AFP, you in the technical working group, besides Senator, the good sponsor, it's elementary. The number of units correspond to the number of hours a subject is taken up in a week. What is the problem of the AFP with respect to calling a spade, giving it 4 units if it's 4 hours a week, instead of requiring a student to go through 4 hours a week of training and only giving him 3 units of credit? May problema po ba doon?
Oh, we can adjust, Mr. President. We can make it 4 units. It corresponds to 4 units, then we can adjust. We can make it 4 units.
Thank you, Mr. President,
Thank you,
Your Honor. Again, but may I ask, what is their basic reservation with, again, they should know it, even in NDCP, if they went through NDCP, it's the same rule. The number of units correspond to the number of hours of instruction or training in a week. Was there a reason behind this, Mr. President, Your Honor? In fact, it's not even in the proposed bill.
There, maybe, Mr. President, I am also a product of ROTC. Kinasanayan na noon pa na 3 units talaga yung ROTC per semester. Pero minsan nga, umaabot kami ng buong araw yung ROTC namin, buong Sabado. Pero ang kinikredit ay 3 units lang, Mr. President. So maybe it's high time for us to reconcile. And I agree with the good interpellator, the gentleman from
Thank you for
Sorsogon.
that. Thank you for that, Mr. President, Your Honor. So, moving on, Mr. President, there are certain exemptions in the ROTC mandatory training. Would that be correct? May mga in-exempt kayo sa panukalang
Yes,
batas?
Mr. President. Actually, there's no exemption, Mr. President. There are only specialized curriculum for those specialized group of people.
So can I say that the 2 other programs under NSTP, as it stands today, would be an option for those people who are exempted in the mandatory ROTC training,
Not
as
actually,
provided for in Section 6?
not actually, Mr. President. Only they are exempted from the military subjects, Mr. President. But all others ay iti-take up pa rin lang, Mr. President, owing to their physical disability or owing to the religious belief that bawal sa kanila humawak ng armas. Lahat yan kinukonsider natin, Mr. President, including foreign students, Mr. President. They are not totally exempted, but they have a special, we will prepare a special POI for them kung saan hindi kasama doon yung military aspect of the curriculum.
Hindi po ba yun na yung inaalok ngayon ng NSTP? Yung military aspect, yun yung mandatory ROTC, tapos may 2 pa siyang option, di po ba? Yung sa literacy at sa community. Now, will those 2 be an option in the sponsor's mind insofar as Section 6 is concerned for those who are exempted from military training? As you mentioned, the foreigners, persons with disabilities, and those whose religion prohibit them from so doing?
Well, Mr. President, it would be different. Kaya natin ni-repeal yung NSTP law dahil literacy training service at saka yung CW training service ay gusto natin walain. Isa na lang ang curriculum, Mr. President. Pero dito sa special circumstances, kung saan kailangan nila na hindi po pwede silang mag-undergo ng rigid physical military training, tinanggal natin yung portion ng physical military training portion. All the rest ay i-undergo nila yung mga lectures na yan, Mr. President.
Ano po ang pupuno dun sa tatanggalin natin?
Wala na, Mr. President.
So nakatanga na lang sila?
Hindi po, wala pong yung physical military training, tinanggal natin. So, yung mga lectures about survival, about disaster preparedness, about nationalism, patriotism, about civic-mindedness and volunteerism ay nandun po, Mr. President.
Understood, Mr. President, but while the others are undergoing the military aspect of ROTC training, what would these quote-unquote exempted individuals be doing? They will not be asked to report, they will not be asked to attend, or they will just be there and sit. What is the intention of the good sponsor, Mr. President, Your Honor?
Well, hindi sila kasama magmarcha-marcha, Mr. President. Hindi sila kasama sa mga firing, mga drills about marksmanship. Hindi sila kasama sa mga ground, land, and ground navigation. Hindi sila kasama sa mga rope exercises. Kasama lang sila sa lecture, Mr. President. So, nandun lang sila sa malamig na lugar, makinig sa lecture, Mr. President. Hindi po sila i-expose sa heat under the sun, hindi sila i-expose sa elements. They will be treated accordingly, Mr. President. But, meron pa rin silang lecture na papakinggan, Mr. President.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. President, Your Honor. This representation appreciates it. Moving forward, Mr. President, Your Honor, there's a phone-in question from our Finance Chair, Senator Angara. How much is the cost of one set of uniform, including combat boots?
Kano yun? One set of uniform, including combat boots, Mr. President. Meron tayo ditong breakdown, Mr. President, if I may. BDU or battle dress uniform with cap, belt, with buckle. So my belt and buckle ito is 1,500. The combat boots is 1,200. The olive drab shirt, one piece of olive drab shirt cost 250 pesos. And socks, pair of socks, Mr. President, 100 pesos. A total of 3,250 pesos per set of uniform.
Ang total ko po, 3,050. Where did I go wrong? 3,250?
3,250, Mr. President. 3,250.
Please indulge me, Mr. President, Your Honor. Again, can we have it again, Mr. President, Your Honor? I was following through with the amounts you were giving. My total is 3,050. Can we go through it again, Mr. President?
Yeah, I say it again, Mr. President. BDU or battle dress uniform with cap, belt, with buckle, 1,500. Combat boots, 1,200. Hoodie or olive drab shirt, one piece, 250 pesos. One pair of socks, 100 pesos, Mr. President. A total of 3,250.
Again, Mr. President, Your Honor, my total is 3,050.
I stand corrected, Mr. President. In-overprice ko na, hindi pa nga na-implement, in-overprice ko na. Sorry, Mr. President, I might be charged of corruption here. 3,050, Mr. President.
Yes.
Sorry.
Mr. President. Now, this will be given for free, correct, Mr. President, Your Honor?
Yes, Mr. President.
So once the program is in full swing, it starts, of course, with first-year college students in all HEI and TVET schools offering a degree of more than 2 years. How many students do you estimate that will be, or at the very least, that is as of today? Ilan yung bagong first year ba sa TVET, Look, SUK at lahat ng HCI, private man o public?
Yes, Mr. President, we have an estimated of 1.5 million student cadets freshman for uh, upon the implementation of this law, Mr. President. 1.5 million.
So if you multiply that, a round figure of 1.5 million, that's 4.575 billion for uniforms.
Yes, Mr. President.
Would that be correct?
Yes, Mr. President.
Wala pa po yung mga laruang replay. O
Wala pa,
lumang
Mr. President.
Granman, o lumang Armalite na papahiram. Wala pa yan.
Wala pa, Mr. President.
What would be the cost of the other paraphernalia if you already have one?
Yung mga kumpas,
For 1.5 million students, which on the second year will be 3 million students. Because it will now cover 2 years. But you won't give new uniforms, but at least the paraphernalia needed, the equipment needed, should be able to address or take care of 3 million undergoing ROTC.
Well, Mr. President, the other training requirements are most of them, Mr. President, are already with the Armed Forces of the Philippines and with the present ROTC units. That is why it is not included in our computation. Yung mga present ROTC units ay meron na po sila mga dummy rifles, meron na sila mga kumpas, and kung wala man, the AP can provide this anytime, Mr. President.
Can we have that inventory, Mr. President, submitted to us insofar as yung sinasabing garan na pwedeng gamitin, either decommissioned or kahoy lang? Ang ginamit namin noon, naalala ko, sa UP Dilimanon, ay tunay na garan na decommissioned lamang kaya sobrang bigat. When I was in a CAT in high school, we used wooden rifles. So maybe if such an inventory exists for the same to be submitted. Not necessarily at this time, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, but if I may, I have here the estimate, Mr. President, about the dummy rifle at 1,200 each per ROTC unit, nangangailangan ng 50, meaning isang kumpanya ito, one company. It's 60,000 pesos, Mr. President. Yung
One
dummy
company
rifle.
is how many people, Mr. President, Your Honor?
One company is 50, Mr. President.
50?
Around 100 to 130, the one company, Mr. President, but we only require 50 rifles, Mr. President.
Just to ask the sponsor, is one company, I think it's about 100. Kasi
Yeah.
4 companies to a battalion, di ba?
Yes, Mr.
400 members to a battalion.
100 to 130. It varies, Mr. President.
I can also
Ibabase
ask
natin yung
our
infantry
Sergeant
battalion.
General here.
Yes, sir.
Sergeant General. Di ba yung
Thank you for that information, Mr. President, Your Honor. Still, maybe get an inventory from the DND and or AFP with respect to available assets and material that can be used for this purpose that will perhaps lower the cost.
Yes, Mr. President. I will.
Moving forward, Mr. President, Your Honor, Section 13 provides for a training program for training instructors. May we know, how does the sponsor envision this when we roll this out? Meaning to say, what is the program of instruction or curriculum for this training program for training instructors? How long do you foresee it to be? How many will be trained per region, per school, per province, per town to undertake this mandatory ROTC training, and how much would it cost?
Mr. President, the initial implementation of the ROTC program is spread in a timeline of 5 years, Mr. President. 5 years and 5 phases, Mr. President. For phase 1, we have the core group training. Phase 2, we have the administrators training. Phase phase 3 is the first year implementation, and phase 4 is the second year of implementation, and uh, the fifth year is the third year of implementation. And we expect that on the fifth year, everything will be settled down, Mr. President. So on the first phase, Mr. President, uh, it's the core group training, ROTC units. For phase 1, Mr. President, it yeah, we will be training 120 uh, personnel, Mr. President, for the core group, and will be divided to 40 30-man mobile training teams to conduct trainers training in 17 regions nationwide, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Your Honor, does each phase correspond to a year?
Not really, Mr. President. Phase 1 here, but pwede tayo mag-adjust, Mr. President, anytime in the implementation, because this is dependent to the enactment of this bill into law. But then the presumption is it is going to be made into law this year, 2023. So ito po yung ginawa natin na pacing, Mr. President. First quarter to fourth quarter of 2023 is phase 1. First quarter up to third quarter of 2024 is phase 2. Fourth quarter of 2024 to third quarter of 2025 is phase 3, Mr. President. And fourth quarter of 2025 to third quarter of 2026 is phase 4, Mr. President.
Mr. President, my understanding is the phasing is the general plan of the good sponsor or the government. It is not found in the bill except for the statement that there shall be an initial implementation of 2 years via pilot implementation, and thereafter we shall see. Because Mr. President, Your Honor, even if we pass it this year, it becomes a law by December, for example. How can you do your training for the Corps when you don't have a program of instruction yet? And the bill suggests that it will be done in 90 days' time. So if at all, the POI, which I presume should take some time, will be done by the end of the first quarter of next year, assuming we pass it before the end of the year. So again, Mr. President, the phasing is not in the bill itself. So if it does not correspond to the years, each phase would correspond to a year. So again, how much does it cost to train the Corps? The 1,000, did I hear the gentleman correctly? 1,200 or 120?
120, Mr. President.
120. And how much will it cost to train? And are these trainees existing employees of HEIs, TVETs, or are these new hires? Are these existing employees of the AFP, DND, CHED, or TESDA, or are we hiring new employees?
They will be coming from the active, the ranks of active personnel of the AFP, Mr. President. Kukunin natin sila from the, meron naman tayong standing reserve commands ngayon, but kukulangin yon. So we will be getting people from the tactical units, yung mga infantry battalions na nandun sa Mindanao at sa Visayas, ipo-pull out natin, then they will undergo this training, Mr. President. And yung sinasabi natin na 120, ang ating gagastusin doon is 2,620,000, Mr. President, for the phase 1 core group training program, Mr. President.
Because they're all already
Active.
members of the armed forces of the Philippines in the active or reserve, perhaps. Corps.
Yes, Mr. President.
Is the same true with respect to the instructors, the training instructors? Will the training instructors likewise be members of the armed forces, either active or reserve?
Yes, Mr. President.
And they are being selected because of their military training and background? I
Yes,
presume?
Mr. President. But there are subjects, Mr. President, which are non-military in nature. They can be handled by uh, other members of the faculty of the universities, Mr. President.
Will they be paid? How much are they going to be paid? Is this mandatory or is it voluntary?
Mr. President, just like the NSTP, Mr. President, we will copy this template, Mr. President. The instructor's fee, as usual, hourly rate of an NSTP instructor is 500 for one semester. NSTP requires 54 hours, thus 54 times 500 is 20,000, 27,000, Mr. President. This is quite affordable, Mr. President, because knowing that these instructors are additional salary na lang ito lang, Mr. President, because most of them are currently employed as regular instructors in the HEIs, and others are holding non-teaching positions in the HEI, Mr. President. So additional na lang po nila ito.
Mr. President, it's not merely additional income, it's additional work too, for which they should be actually compensated for.
Yes, I agree, Mr. President. I agree.
Now, Mr. President, Your Honor, what about the police training, which is included in the bill? You only made mention of faculty members from HAIs to teach some historical subjects. What about the police training aspect? Kasama ba sila sa core? Kasama ba sila sa training instructors?
Mr. President, the way we envision it is that the ROTC units will be inviting police lecturers for the portion on law enforcement. They will just be invited, Mr. President, and the bayad ba sila? Bayad yung police? They will be given honorarium, Mr. President.
No, but won't they be trained as well? Hindi naman pwedeng kung ano lang gustong sabihin ng pulis sa Sorsogon, sa Leyte, sa Mindanao. Di ba dapat may curriculum nga tayo, may POI nga tayo eh.
Yes, Mr.
If we-
President. Basic law enforcement is inherent in every policeman, Mr. President. So they can give lectures on law enforcement, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Your Honor, I hope that this program will not simply rely on what's basic to some policemen, which clearly in the hearings of the good gentleman show that there are a lot of policemen, even in high ranks, that do not possess this basic knowledge of law enforcement, even respect for human rights. I hope, Mr. President, Your Honor, that the POI will be taught to them, the curriculum, so to speak, will be taught to them separately on top of whatever stock knowledge they have as a policeman, as a military, as a history teacher, in order to conform with the design of the program, given the inclusion of police training. Now, Mr. President, the point I'm driving at is actually this. The whole ROTC program, kung invited guest lang ang disaster, invited guest lang ang police, invited guest lang yung history teacher, invited guest lang yung patriotism, nationalism. If it were a PI, the POI, the program of instruction, how big would the share be of history, national heroes, disaster preparedness, police training, military training, patriotism, love of country? Or are you assuming that patriotism and love for country is included in the military aspect? So if it were a pie, Mr. President, Your Honor, defined by the number of hours or time spent for each subject matter, what would be the composition of that pie? Ilang porsyento ang military training, Mr. President, Your Honor?
Mr. President, as far as the pie composition of the pie chart presentation as to the composition of the POI, Mr. President, it has yet to be prepared by the CHED, TESDA, and DND, Mr. President. It has yet to be prepared during the crafting of the IRR, Mr. President.
But Mr. President, Your Honor, yung core is composed of purely military personnel. The training instructors are purely military personnel. Policemen will be invited for the law enforcement aspect. HEI Tibet teachers will be invited for the history, love of country, and culture aspect. Are we actually giving them leeway to decide on this? Do you mean to say, Mr. President, Your Honor, that the POI to be decided by CHED, TESDA, and DND can actually recraft NSTP in the mandatory ROTC law through the curriculum? Or is it the intention of the good sponsor for this to be predominantly military? Do they actually have a choice? Because by the composition of the core the gentleman is talking about and the training instructors, they're all members of the AFP, Mr. President, Your Honor. So what freedom or leeway do they actually have?
Well, Mr. President, this is ROTC. So we expect that the core officers that will take charge in its implementation are coming from the armed forces of the Philippines. So that is why sila ang tinututukan natin ngayon na magti-training talaga dahil experience-wise, we know that probably yung mga abuso, yung mga corruption na mangyayari ay manggagaling doon sa implementors ng ROTC. So dito tayo nga nakapokus sa kanila, Mr. President. While for history teachers, for whatever, other components of this POI, Mr. President, meron naman tayong mga available na mga members of the faculty na mga HCIs and technical vocational schools, Mr. President.
I agree, Mr. President, Your Honor. I'm not debating that point. In fact, I'm all for calling a spade from the beginning of the interpellation of this representation. If all the members of the Corps, if all the members of the training instructors are members of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, why can the good gentleman not say that this mandatory ROTC program enshrined or envisioned in the bill will be 70% military, will be 80% military training, will be 60% military training? I'm okay with that, Mr. President, Your Honor. I will not debate the gentleman with that. I just want to know what the intention of the bill is. Because the gentleman said a while ago, it will depend on the POI, which will be crafted by CHED, TESDA, and DND. 2 out of 3, and clearly, civilian na yun. Kung CHED, TESDA, boboto, tig-isa sila, isa lang ang boto ng DND. But all the core, members of the core and the trainers are members of the AFP. So, again, let's call a spade a spade. What is the intent of the good sponsor in passing this measure? Ilang porsyento, together with disaster training, love for country, patriotism, nationalism, gender sensitivity and awareness, civic training, ano yung pie make-up po ng bagong ROTC natin? And I will accept any answer, Mr. President, Your Honor, if it says 80% military, 20% military, at least on the record, those who will craft the POI would know the direction given the intent of Congress in this matter.
Well, Mr. President, we can make it. If I have the liberty to do it, then we can make it 40% military, defense, 40% for defense preparedness, 20% for disaster preparedness, so 60. My remaining 40. 20% for love of country, patriotism, nationalism, then 20% for civic-mindedness and volunteerism, Mr. President. 40, 20, 20, 20, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I won't hold the good sponsor to it, but at the proper time, I would move for this to be included in the bill at mas madali siguro kung divisible by 4 dahil kung 4 na oras, edi at least madaling i-divide din, di ba? In 1 day, 1 oras dedicated to this, 3 days, 3 hours dedicated on, so on and so forth. Or in 1 month, one day, one training day is dedicated for this. The 3 other days are dedicated correspondingly to the other subjects. At the proper time, Mr. President.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly subscribe to the wisdom of the good gentleman from Sorsogon.
Again, I have not, even if it says 50% military, 25% civic duty, and then 25% disaster preparedness, I'm okay with it, Mr. President, Your Honor. As long as we provide adequate guidelines for those who will draft the POI so that it would not constitute an undue delegation of legislative power.
Thank you for that, Mr. President. That would be very helpful in crafting a very good law, Mr. President.
Moving
Salamat.
forward, Mr. President, Your Honor, I refer you to Section 14, paragraphs B and C. You make mention, or the bill makes mention, of RA 3019, otherwise known as the Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act, as well as the revised penal code, I quote, revised penal code on bribery, penalties provided for under the revised penal code on bribery and corruption. Are we on the same page, Mr. President, Your Honor?
Yes, Mr. President.
Now, Mr. President, several questions on this provision. To begin with, there is no provision in the revised penal code on corruption. The only provision in the revised penal code would be making mention of bribery, given that the revised penal code is of 1932 vintage. Corruption was made mention of in RA 3019. So perhaps the committee can revisit this to make it reflect that the revised penal code indeed penalizes bribery, but it is RA 3019 which penalizes corruption in its various shapes, sizes, and forms in paragraph C of section 14. Number two, Mr. President, Your Honor, a reading of section 14, paragraph C would seem to indicate that you are now opening up RA 3019, the Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act, and the revised penal code provisions on bribery to private individuals who actually performed the prohibited act. Mr. President, Your Honor, the basic requirement under the revised penal code on the provisions on bribery, the basic requirement in the anti-graft law, RA 3019, is that the person involved is a public officer or employee. Section 14, paragraph C would seem to indicate that if an officer, an employee, an official of a private HEI accepts a bribe, that he or she, in connection with the implementation of the ROTC law, that he or she can be sued under the provisions of RA 3019 and bribery under the provisions of the revised penal code. Is that the intention, Mr. President, Your Honor, of the distinguished sponsor? Effectively amending both the revised penal code and the anti-graft law to include a private individual receiving a bribe in connection with the implementation of this act.
Well, we have no intention, Mr. President, of amending the Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act, nor the revised penal code, Mr. President. If the good gentleman from Sorsogon has some findings in this particular provision, Mr. President, then in due time, during the period of interpellation, I'm going to accept all interpellations, all amendments that will be introduced by the good gentleman, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Honor. Can we ask the subcommittee to kindly look into it? Because if that is the intent, then we should so state in the repealing clause. If that is not the intent, then section 14, paragraphs B and C should be clarified to that effect. On the same subject, Mr. President, Your Honor, if it was not the intent to file a case for bribery or graft and corruption against officials of private HEIs and TVET schools, so ano na po ang pwedeng ikaso sa kanila? Parang dehado naman yung mga nagtatrabaho sa SUKS, sa looks na government officials. They can be sued for bribery. They can be sued for Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act violation, RA 3019. So what is now the case that can or will be filed against an official of a private HCI who accepts a bribe in connection with the implementation of the proposed ROTC law?
They can be charged with Article 212 of the revised penal code, Mr. President, corruption of public officials.
But they are not public officials, Mr. President.
Sorry,
Again,
sorry, Mr. President. I stand corrected. Sorry. 212. Kanina.
Perhaps the subcommittee, Mr. President, can look into it as well.
Yes.
To make it at par, so, because it seems unfair that those working in government are placed at a disadvantage compared to those who are working in the private sector insofar as offenses in violation of this act is concerned.
Yes, Mr. President.
At
We
the
will.
proper time, Mr. President, Your Honor. Still on this point, Mr. President, it states here in section 14B and in other sections, insofar as the imposition of the penalty is concerned, that the penalty imposed shall be in its maximum. May I ask the reason why and what the basis, if at all, for stating in the proposed bill that the penalties to be imposed, whether violation of RA 3019 or bribery, will be in its maximum?
In order to send the message, Mr. President, that it can be meted with a maximum penalty if they are going to commit such a crime, Mr. President, para maiwasan natin yung pang-aabuso, Mr. President.
I'll give you an example, Mr. President, Your Honor. The penalty for hazing if death results would be reclusion perpetua. Actually, there is no period indicated or provided for. There's only one penalty. So automatically, that will be imposed. Number two, Mr. President, Your Honor, under the revised penal code, usually the penalty in its maximum will be imposed only if there are aggravating circumstances that is not diminished by any alternative or mitigating circumstances. Is it the intention of the good sponsor that a presumption is being made that violation of this bill, when it becomes a law, is automatically mala prohibita, an aggravating circumstance, and therefore the maximum penalty will automatically be imposed by any judge during sentencing? Is that the intention, Mr. President, Your Honor?
Mr. President, the fact that they violate the provisions of this law, Mr. President, is already considered as an aggravating circumstance, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Your Honor, referring the good gentleman, the good sponsor, to section 22,
Will not be considered.
any act of abuse, including verbal, corruption, hazing, torture, data privacy rights violation, violation of human rights, in connection with the implementation of this act, the penalty imposable shall be in its maximum. So it's not only hazing that's being considered here. It's not only corruption that's being considered here. Even violation of the Data Privacy Act, automatically, which is a special law, by the way, automatically the judge, this law instructs, should impose the maximum penalty. Again, Mr. President, I don't question the wisdom behind it. I'm only seeking clarification so that the intent of Congress, of the author, when we vote on this and pass this, is clear with respect to those implementing it, whether in the executive or the judiciary. Yun po talaga yung intention sa panukalang batas na ito?
Yes, Mr. President, because we want to discourage really abuses, Mr. President. That is why we we see it as a deterrent, Mr. President, if makita nila na maximum talaga yung imimit na penalty sa kanila, Mr. President, para ma-discourage sila mag-abuso, Mr. President.
Thank you for that, Mr. President, Your Honor. I think historically, there is good reason to do that, Mr. President, because NSTP was passed after the death, the murder, so to speak, of Mr. Chua, a student of the University of Santo Tomas. That was one of the reasons that sparked the outrage and perhaps the push by Congress at that time to abolish the ROTC and replace it with NSTP. Just a brief manifestation on that point, Mr. President. Moving forward, Mr. President, Your Honor, Section 21 says there will be a mandatory review at the end of the 2-year pilot program. The DND shall submit a report to Congress, presumably to the Congressional Oversight Committee, on the result of the mandatory review. May I ask, Mr. President, anong mangyayari after the mandatory review? Can the Joint Oversight Committee, if there were so many or a lot of abuses in this pilot episode or program of the ROTC program, can the Joint Oversight Committee tell them, you cannot implement this in all schools yet,
No,
despite the passage of the law?
no, Mr. President, our power will be limited to amending the law, Mr. President.
So even if the review says that it is all wrong, malito, dapat may amendahan. Hindi pwedeng suspindihin. Hindi pwedeng ipagpaliban muna hanggat hindi na amendahan yung batas. I think that's the intent initially of the 2-year pilot implementation. Isn't that the intent of the 2-year review? Kasi kung hindi rin lang, nag-review pa tayo, nag-pilot pa tayo, edi birahin na natin sa lahat agad.
Well,
Very much like,
Mr. President, it is already in the implementation phase, and it is already in the purview of the executive branch of government, Mr. President. So maybe we can exercise our power of if they don't implement this law properly, Mr. President, we can exercise our power of the purse during budget hearing, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Your Honor, the problem with depriving them of the lifeblood, of money, of the purse, is still there is a law that requires a student to complete these 2 years of ROTC training before he graduates. If a school cannot implement it because they don't have the money, if an SUC cannot implement it if they don't have the money, then how will the student graduate? Mr. President, the point I'm driving at is actually this, to abbreviate the proceedings. At the proper time, I hope the good sponsor will consider an amendment empowering the Congressional Oversight Committee to, number 1, as I stated earlier, sign off to the POI, to the Program of Instruction, before it is handed down to the core and the trainers, the trainees trainers. Number 2, after the review, sign off again to its continued implementation either at the pilot stage or level or at a merely expanded stage or full-blown already after the 2nd year, given the review after 2 years. This has been done in some other legislations, Mr. President, to avoid the passage of an amendatory or repealing legislation, and also to avoid the waste of time insofar as the passage of a new law to correct errors done in the passage of a previous law. Since the JCOC is composed of members of both Congresses, House and Senate, then perhaps the House would consider this amendment as well. It will indeed give Congress not only the power of oversight, but actually more control insofar as the POI and the actual implementation or rollout of this program is concerned.
Yes, Mr. President, I subscribe to the wisdom of the gentleman from Sorsogon. But again, I have doubts in my mind. I am entertaining some doubts in my mind because I have heard of a Supreme Court ruling that once the law is already passed by Congress, wala na tayong pakialam doon sa implementation ng Mr. President, and that portion is already in the implementation phase, Mr. President. But forgive me, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just limited. My knowledge is just limited to what I have read and what I have heard during plenary discussions. So, yun lang po ang alam ko. But you are a good lawyer, so I subscribe to the wisdom of the good gentleman, Professor Sugon. If we can do that, that would be to our advantage, Mr. President. Hindi po ako nag-oppose dyan. That we are putting ourselves in a very good advantage if that provision can be incorporated in this measure, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Your Honor, for the record as well, that decision of the Supreme Court mostly pertains to the matter on pork barrel, which basically said that once Congress passes the budget, it can no longer interfere with respect to its implementation in the course of its definition of what pork barrel means, and that pork barrel is prohibited under the Constitution, under existing law, and consists of an encroachment of the powers of the executive, given the principle of separation of powers between the three co-equal branches. But I would rather, Mr. President, that someone question it and let it be weighed upon by the Supreme Court, whether strike it down or uphold it. But for Congress to insist on its power of review, because we are good intentioned anyway. We want to make sure that the law we are passing that will affect the lives of every college student will indeed be for their own good and for the country's good. Moving forward, Mr. President, Your Honor, one of my last few points before I suspend my interpellation, according to the data of Senator Gatchalian, if I remember correctly my readings of the hearings, about 1.3 million students do not go to college coming from senior high. Would that be an accurate figure, Senator Sherwin? He
Mr.
is
President?
nodding, so yes. So, Mr. President, now, if our strategy for inculcating patriotism, nationalism, love for country, disaster preparedness, preparedness to defend the country, and civic duty would be through the mandatory ROTC program, what about the 1.3 million students who graduated from senior high but who will no longer or actually do not proceed to college? What would you do with these 1.3 million Filipinos, which is roughly equivalent to the number that enter college every year? So if you look at the data, actually, 50% go to college and will go through this program. The other 50% will not. What do we do about them?
Mr. President, we have an existing law, RA 7077, or the AAP Reservist Act, that will cater to this particular segment of society, Mr. President. Yung mga out-of-school youth, Mr. President, they will be required to render mandatory military training under this law, Mr. President. But unluckily, this is not being observed or not being implemented, Mr. President. But then, if you are going to ask me, how are we going to treat this particular segment of our society, the out-of-school youth, then the answer is RA 7077, Mr. President, or the veterans Section 16 of...
It's not that I don't want to include them, Mr. President, Your Honor. My basic question is based on the fact that if indeed, on the presumption, on the premise of this bill, that if indeed nationalism, patriotism, love for country, disaster preparedness, and civic duty can only be learned, mastered, and formed in a young Filipino aged 18 to 25 through the ROTC mandatory program, edi paano yung hindi dumaan dito? Edi we cannot for sure say that they love their country, that they are patriotic, that they are nationalistic, that they are ready to help any Filipino in need in times of disasters or calamities. If indeed this is the vehicle, the way, the road by which we can inculcate patriotism, nationalism, and all of those values we mentioned, then what about the other segment? 50% that don't go to college.
Yes, Mr. President, kung po pwede lang sana, everybody goes the same way. But the problem is we are constrained by budget, Mr. President. You know, the initial intent of this measure was to cater grades 11 to 12, senior high school. But nung nakita namin yung computation, na kung sa grades 11 to 12, napakalaking budget ang kailangan, Mr. President. So that's why we elevate that to college. Dahil alam natin na hindi naman lahat ng mga senior high school ay pupunta sa college. So kukunti ngayon ang gastos natin, Mr. President. But then again, kahit na hindi na sila pupunta sa college, meron tayong batas na RA 7077 na sila ay kailangan mag-undergo ng military training, Mr. President. Doon po, sila po, yun po ang doon po, yung batas na yun ang magkikater nitong mga out-of-school youth, Mr. President.
So ang tina-target lang talaga natin sa panukalang batas na ito ay kalahati ng kabataang Pilipino na makakapasok sa kolehiyo.
So far, Mr. President, because of budgetary constraints, Mr. President.
Agreed, Mr. President. I thank the good gentleman for his candidness. Last 2 points, Mr. President, Your Honor, before I suspend my interpellation. Nakalagay po dito na yung nasa NSTP sa ngayon, magpapatuloy pa rin sa ilalim ng NSTP, hindi po ba?
Yes, Mr.
So,
President.
If this bill becomes a law, let's say in December, it will be effective, let's say in January, pero may core training pa, meron merong training of trainers pa, meron ka pang 2-year program, so a 2-year pilot implementation. So bago i-require to sa first year o yung papasok pa lang na first year sa 2026. Would that be correct, Mr. President?
Mr. President, once this bill comes into law and it is going to be implemented, meron tayong pilot
2 years.
program nito, Mr. President. And bibigyan po natin sila ng option, Mr. President, yung papasok na estudyante kung gusto nila mag-ROTC or ipatuloy nila yung NSTP na kung saan sila naka-enroll ngayon, Mr. President. So we will allow them to finish the NSTP program that they have entered, Mr. President. So siguro mga 2 years pa bago tayo magkakaroon ng full implementation, Mr. President. After 2 years, yun na, kompleto na yan. But ito first 2 years, pwede natin sila bigyan ng leeway na ipagpatuloy yung NSTP nila.
Again, Mr. President, Your Honor. Chronologically, we pass it before the end of 2023. 2 years ang pilot implementation. The pilot implementation, Mr. President, Your Honor, as envisioned in the bill, will not cover all schools.
Yes,
It will cover only certain schools.
yes, Mr. President.
Pilot
Precisely.
nga lang eh.
Yes,
So may mga school na niwalang ROTC pilot. NSTP sila.
yes,
Di ba?
tuloy yung NSTP nila.
At the end of the 2-year period, after the review, so that's 2024, 2025.
Yes.
So 2026 pa lang ito, full implementation, assuming walang problema, aberya, at gusto pa rin natin ito ituloy. 2026. And in 2026, Mr. President, Your Honor, it will be the school year of 2026. And number 2, it will apply to those who are enrolling in first year in 2026. Not those in the second year already, not those in the third or fourth year or fifth year, first year ng 2026. Pagdating ng 2027, bagong papasok ulit ng first year ng 2027, tutuloy yung mga first year ng 2026 para sa second year nila sa mandatory ROTC sa 2027. Would that be correct, Mr. President, Your Honor?
Correct, Mr. President.
Now, Mr. President, if that is the intention, then again at the proper time, if the NSTP will still continue within the pilot period of 2 years, then perhaps in the repealing clause, we might want to adjust it too, because in the repealing clause, mention is made that the bill is repealing the NSTP law. which might not be really accurate because it will still be in effect until it is made to apply to all schools after the 2-year pilot implementation.
Yes, Mr. President, thank you for reminding this representation. Thank
At
you.
the at the proper time, Mr. President, Your Honor, we will also be making the suggested amendments, rather. One last point, Mr. President, Your Honor, on the fees. 50% of the cost of 1 unit is the suggestion of the good sponsor.
Yes, Mr. President.
What would be the budgetary implication of this? So if we are at 4 units, so 50% of the cost of 4 units or the equivalent of 2 units, how much would that be? Does the good sponsor have an idea? Mention was made earlier, approximately 5 billion for the uniform, including the equipment and paraphernalia. What about the cost of the tuition for mandatory ROTC?
The CHID has not yet given us their computation, Mr. President. Maybe in due time, we'll give that computation to
Mr.
the court
President,
gentleman.
for the information of the good sponsor, the CHED cannot answer that question. The money since 2022 has not been given to CHED insofar as free tertiary, the implementation of the free tertiary education is concerned. It is downloaded automatically and directly to the SUCs, the LUCs, and the public HCIs. CHED does not have any data with respect to how much is the per unit cost of the school. So data would have to be obtained by the subcommittee or by the resources persons beside you directly from the schools, with a warning and caveat, Mr. President, Your Honor. The cost per unit per school is different and there are no two schools with the same cost per unit. Number two, unless Congress does something about it before the year is over, the moratorium for the increase of tuition fees of all SUCs and LUCs will expire on December 31, 2023, and they are free to increase it accordingly. That's why DBM is actually in a quandary, because if they're mandated to pay by the free tertiary education law, the tuition fee in all SUCs and LUCs accredited by CHED, they actually have no idea what the figure looks like after these schools increase their respective fees after the end of the year. So perhaps you can coordinate directly through the schools. I'm not even mentioning private educational institutions, because it will be a cost to them too. So
Yes.
that we have a vague idea how much it would cost government in 2024 and especially in 2026 when it's fully implemented, if this bill should be passed.
Yes, Mr. President. The CHED has committed to us that they will be the one to collate all this data, Mr. President. And I hope makuha nila.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Honor, because budget season is fast approaching. This is clearly not in the proposed budget of CHED. This is not in the proposed budget of TESDA. This is not in the proposed budget of DND. Rightly so, because it's not yet a law. But if there is an assumption that this will be passed, given the overwhelming support according to the survey or in this chamber, and given that it is already passed in the House, then perhaps it's about time to carve out an amount in the proposed 2024 budget for the putative implementation of this act. If not directly mentioning or making specific mention of this act, if there is still no law at that time, at the very least, providing a lump sum amount in the budget of these departments in order to pay for the initial implementation, training of the core trainers, and the pilot implementation in some schools.
I agree, Mr. President. I agree.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the candidness and as well as the patience of the distinguished sponsor. In the meantime, Mr. President, I suspend my interpellation, awaiting the submission of some documents. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, distinguished sponsor, for your answers and for your accommodation to this representation's questions.
Thank you for your questions, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Escudero, Majority Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. We are indeed very happy to hear the exchanges of ideas on this particular matter. Mr. President, at this juncture, may I just move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 2034 under Committee Report number 62. So move, Mr. President.
Is there any objection? Hearing none. Senate Bill number 2034 under Committee Report number 62 is hereby suspended.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, with the permission of the body, I move that we resume consideration of Senate Bill number 1846. This is the Bill on Internet Transactions Act of 2022. I so move, Mr. President.
Is there an objection? Hearing none. Consideration of Senate Bill number 1846 under Committee Report number 22 is now in order.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the parliamentary status of the measure is that we reopened the period of interpellations to allow the members to ask questions on the substitute bill. And with that, Mr. President, I move to recognize the sponsor and chairperson of the measure and the Committee on Trade, Senator Mark Villar, our Deputy Majority Leader, and to interpellate Senator Aquilino Coco Pimentel III, our Minority Leader. So move, Mr. President.
Our Deputy Majority Leader, the sponsor of the measure, and our Minority Leader are hereby recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. With the permission of our sponsor, if I could commence or start my interpellation on the Internet Transactions Act bill, Mr. President. And if I could ask for this understanding, if some of my questions are based on the original bill, we have not yet really finished our study of the substitute bill, Mr. President.
Yes, we open ourselves to your questions, Your Honor.
Well, Mr. President, can we state for the record what did we change in the bill reported out when compared to the substitute bill which was just filed recently, Mr. President? Yung mga highlights po ng pagbabago.
Yes, the changes made in the substitute bill is the result of the discussions with the different Senate offices to improve the wordings of the bill. The salient features of these changes are as follows. One, modify the wording in the definition of terms to be consistent with the definitions used in the Philippine national standards, such as B2B, business to business, C2C, consumer to consumer, definition of digital platform, among others. Two, the provisions on scope and coverage were modified to further define who or what are covered. Three, the provisions on subpoena were changed to remove the word certification as sufficient evidence of contempt. The provision in,
Contempt?
was changed to removing the certification as sufficient evidence of contempt. Four, additional provisions of the issuance of compliance order and blacklisting of online businesses is included in the substitute bill. And five, online dispute resolution is further highlighted in the bill. Lastly, the provision on liabilities was also amended to highlight that the e-retailer or online merchant shall be primarily liable for indemnifying the online consumer as determined by a court or regulatory agency. An e-marketplace or digital platform that facilitated the subject online purchase shall be subsidiarily liable to the online consumer given the considerations listed in the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. So we changed the substitute bill changes the liability of the vendor as well as of the platform, Mr. President.
I think it's more an improvement of the wording, even in the previous version, the committee report. It was still during the consumer, if it's the e-marketplace is subsidiarily liable while the e-retailer is primarily liable. So that concept doesn't change.
Okay, yes, sir. So
It's more in the wording.
from the very start, the committee has decided to make the platform or the e-marketplace only subsidiarily liable, Mr. President. So,
Yes, yes, that is correct.
opo, but yun na nga, but we have personal testimonies or experiences that a lot of customers of these e-marketplaces get scammed or swindled because of the services of the e-marketplaces, Mr. President, and then they are not given sufficient remedy or compensation by the e-marketplaces. So, nagkakilala si buyer victim nakilala niya si vendor scammer through the e-marketplace site, Mr. President. Ayun, and then pag magreklamo na ngayon si buyer victim sa e-marketplace, somehow the e-marketplaces find a way to wash their hands and then say, we are not liable for this, for the scam perpetrated against you. Go after the vendor. And then when the buyer victim asks the e-marketplace or the platform for the details of the vendor, the victim is not given the details of the vendor, Mr. President. So, marami po akong reklamong ganyang naririnig, and if that is the actual situation happening per experience of our e-buyers, Mr. President, then I think the only way to force these e-marketplaces to shape up and improve their mechanics, their rules, and make their vendors, participating vendors, liable and really not scam the purchasers, the buyers, is to make them solidarily liable together with the vendors that they allow to sell in their e-marketplaces, Mr. President.
Yes, I understand your point, Mr. Chairman, but let me just, first of all, I think that's exactly the reason why this bill is very important, is that it creates an e-commerce bureau wherein these complaints can be taken up by the Department of Trade and Industry. It gives them a medium to address all their concerns with these platforms. And at the same time, I think it's very important that we also make the distinction between the e-marketplace and the e-retailer, whereas the e-retailer directly sells it, so he's primarily liable. But of course, in the case of an e-marketplace, there is another seller, or it's a way of connecting to the buyer and the seller. So I think the primarily should still be with the person who sold the product. Now, that's why if the initial liability is not resolved by the original seller, then it becomes the liability. It becomes an issue, a liability of the platform. But it's important to make that distinction, because if you make the platform, the e-market, primarily liable, then it might give the incentive to the seller not to address the concerns of the buyer. It's almost like a moral hazard if you don't make that distinction, because then the seller would be there would be an incentive for the seller not to address the concern, since the primary liability is with the e-marketplace.
Ito pong isang example po na-relay sa akin, and I find the complaining party credible, because I know him very well. Using an e-marketplace or the platform, the online platform, nag-order siya ng isang bagay. Sinabihan siya ng vendor, wag mong gawing gawin mo na lang pay to cash yung transaction. So, winidraw niya yung original order niya, place the same order with the same vendor on the same platform, this time making it cash on delivery. And then, nung dineliver, nabayaran, tapos lumabas na hindi genuine na item po yung na dineliver. So, and then nung nagreklamo na, ang sabi ng platform sa kanya sa computer system namin ang nakasulat doon hindi delivered yung item. So that's some scammer vendors have already found a way to maybe circumvent the controls of the e-marketplaces. So and yet when the victim said na okay, you don't want to directly refund me or reimburse me, then give me the details of that vendor. Ayaw naman din pong ibigay. So in this particular case, don't you think, Mr. President, if the online platforms have this attitude or this frame of mind or this defense, that we really should, from the very start, make them solidarily liable para ayusin po nila yung systems nila. Kasi in this particular case, dun talaga nagtagpo si buyer and si seller dun nagtagpo sa online platform And naloko siya using the online platform. And it's too much to expect from the buyer to ask the online platform, is this a legitimate transaction when I met the vendor through your platform? So we have, what I'm saying, Mr. President, is we have a problem because these are real life experiences and feedback that we are getting.
Yes.
The online platforms are not shaping up because they know that the victim, the buyer victim, has no choice but to run after the vendor. Pero ang basic tanong is, why is a scammer vendor present on the online platform or in the e-marketplace? So what was the level of vigilance or standard of the online platform in allowing that particular vendor in selling to Filipinos through their platform? So
Yes.
ang point is nangyayari po yan. And then if this bill becomes law and we have this concept of subsidiary liability, this might not help, Mr. President.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I think important also in this law is one of the provisions is the creation of an online business registry, precisely so that the DTI has a record of all these vendors online, and of course these e-marketplaces are compelled to have this information ready should the need arise that they need to contact these sellers. At the same time, I think it's also important to note that in this bill, and I think this addresses this concern also, the DTI has more teeth in implementing measures that would discipline this type of behavior, especially in particularly the power to take down these sites, and also the power to blacklist certain sites that are found not to commit, that are found unresponsive to the responsibilities as defined by the bill. The responsibilities of the seller are clearly defined in the bill. And if they do not perform their duty, this is where the liability for the e-marketplace comes in. If they do not perform their due diligence for their sellers in connection, then they also become liable for these things. Of course, it's up to them also to discipline the people who are utilizing their marketplace. That's because they're primary liable. But if it's found, the reason why it's subsidiarily liable, if it's found that they did not do their due diligence, then they're also liable at the same time for this. At the same time, the DTI, if they find that the actions of the platforms or the retailers are unresponsive and they're not fulfilling their obligations as defined by the law, then they can take them down or they can blacklist them. So I think that's a very important power that will be added to the DTI that would help in the future resolve that kind of issue that you said, Mr. President.
So, Mr. President, so, when this bill becomes law, should that same scenario, will that scenario which I painted, which is happening today, no longer be happening?
It should not, because they will have the e-commerce bureau. First, they can file their complaint with the e-commerce bureau. If they find, of course, they can also respond to the platform. But at the same time, they also have another option, which is to go to the e-commerce bureau if they feel that their issues are not being resolved properly. And if the DTI finds that the platform or the retailer is unresponsive, then they have measures to compel them to address the issues of the buyer.
So under this bill, Mr. President, should the victim purchaser need information about the vendor which victimized him or her, that the victim can go to the e-commerce bureau for the needed details if the e-marketplace or platform should refuse to divulge the details? Ganun po ba yun? Hawak na ng DTI yan through the
Yes,
e-commerce
that is the
bureau?
purpose, Mr. President, of the online business registry, which will be required for all those who are selling online. At the same time, it should be noted also that if the platform, the e-platform, does not exercise its due diligence with its members or with its sellers, then it is considered it's liable and it has a status of solidary liability.
So, and then under this bill, the e-commerce bureau will divulge the needed information to the complaining party and not invoke any data privacy law or rule, Mr. President? Kasi yun yung masakit eh. Baka pagdating naman sa tunay na buhay na under this law, hingi ka ngayon sa e-commerce bureau, sabihin lang, hindi, data privacy, hindi namin mabigay sa'yo. Balik din tayo sa original situation po natin.
Yes, that's of course that is very important that the information is accessible. So we want the DTI has assured us that during the IRR, in the crafting of the IRR, those particular circumstances will be addressed, wherein the buyer has a legitimate complaint that will allow the DTI to access and divulge the necessary information. So, and that's basically the purpose of the OBR, the Online Business Registry. Right now, there's nothing that really compels people to submit their information. Under this law, the DTI will have an online business registry. They will have a bureau that specifically addresses the concerns of online buyers, and they will have the means by which to discipline the e-retailers and e-platforms.
This is the e-commerce bureau.
Yes, the
Yes, okay,
e-commerce
thank you.
bureau. Yes.
So the data or the information about the vendors participating in an online platform or an e-marketplace would be in the possession of the DTI through the e-commerce bureau. But would this be posted online and be available to the public? Or can this only be accessed if there is what the sponsor said, a legitimate complaint from a party, meaning to say there is an initial screening method to be done by the e-commerce bureau. They will assess whether the complaint is valid or not before they make the information accessible or known, Mr. President. Ano sabi ng bill?
Yes.
Of course, nila online.
That's why we also have one of the provisions there was to create a national trust mark, which will be given to those vendors that have a good record. So that will also be a signal. But aside from that, what you mentioned earlier, the information, the DTI will have that information available in the online business registry. But of course, it won't be posted in public. But I think in the IRR, the use or how the circumstances for which they can be utilized will be defined in the IRR. Of course, it might not be practical to have it posted publicly, and also for the privacy of some of these sellers, it might not be practical. But the information will be ready on hand, and it will be the DTI in conjunction with other relevant agencies who will decide the circumstances for which this information can be utilized.
That's what I fear, Mr. President, yung mga, because the regulations might make it difficult to access. Is there a danger if the information of the vendors participating in these online platforms be posted online, be made available online by the government agency regulating or having jurisdiction over these types of activities, Mr. President? Meron bang danger? Hindi ba mas gusto na rin ni vendor, malaman na rin siya na buong mundo, baka lumaki pa po yung ano niya, clientele po niya.
So far under the bill, it will only be published or made public if should the firm be blacklisted or they be found to not be compliant with the responsibilities as defined under the act. So if it's I understand, Mr. President, that it would if you have some suggestions that we can make a. Of course, we're trying to balance out the needs of privacy. At the same time, we also want to hold them accountable for any infractions. But we are more than willing to hear any suggestions on how to balance these two factors.
Di ba po, one of the mechanisms here in this bill is that the online platform will now be required to submit to the e-commerce bureau, most likely in digital form, all, di ba? All the names of the vendors, addresses, contact numbers, siguro.
Yes, which will be a major improvement from what we have now, because there's not even
Yes,
any
kaya nga. So-
any information available. Even if we wanted to, if there was a complaint, the DTI would have no registry to look up. I mean, no registry to refer to should there be any complaints. So this is
Yes,
a major improvement from the status quo.
So, because this representation is entertaining the idea of making it mandatory, Mr. President, to mandate the posting online of this basic information being given by the online platforms, Mr. President. So, is there is there any policy consideration?
The DTI has expressed openness. Again, it's expressed openness to that suggestion. Again, the purpose of this was just to balance out the privacy with the, of course, with the needs of the consumers should any problems arise. But definitely, I can see your point, Mr. President, and the DTI has expressed that they're open to such a
Because-
such an arrangement.
Parang we cannot see any obvious or immediate danger, Mr. President, in posting this online, unless nga upon deeper study merong there is an evil to be avoided, but as of the moment I cannot think of anything, Mr. President. But it can help. It will help in the transparency.
Yes,
in the
yes,
cost
I
of
agree.
transparency.
Yes, Mr. President.
So if we now do this, and the details of the vendor will be out in the open, and the complaining party will now get the details, can now file the complaint before the e-commerce bureau. So when will the liability, Mr. President, of the online platform or the e-marketplace ever kick in, Mr. President? If hindi na makolekta, hindi na makolektahan yung vendor, scammer vendor, or hindi na makolektahan or hindi nagbabayad, hindi nagko-comply sa order, Is that the time when the subsidiary liability of the online platform kicks in, Mr. President?
Yeah, basically, if the seller, the merchant is unable to fulfill his obligation, I think that's by definition, that's what the subsidiary liability is. That the e-platform is then liable, also, should it be shown that they did not exercise due diligence in assessing the seller. So that's the point of subsidiary liabilities, that initially the liability is with the seller, but should he not be able to fulfill this, or should he not be able to address this liability, then it falls in the e-marketplace.
Yes, but does the complaining party need to initiate another action, Mr. President, or continuation na yan ng original action niya?
Yeah, it's part of the process of the e-commerce bureau. So tuloy-tuloy na yan.
Opo.
Tuloy-tuloy na yan.
So yes,
So-
it will be convenient. It will be
Yes.
convenient for the buyer, the e-purchaser, or the victim to get his remedy, Mr. President. So yan po ang importante sa lahat. Our sponsor mentioned this trust mark. Can we get more information about this? What is this Philippine trust mark, and how is it earned, or how will a vendor or a site get this, and what does it mean? How does it benefit either the vendor or the purchaser or the marketplace, Mr. President?
Yes. Yes. This is the reason why we're proposing that one of the reasons why we propose this to be done by the private sector, whether trust service provider association organization, and only be governed by the DTI through the e-commerce bureau. Establishing the e-commerce trust mark does not only cover policy, there's also technology involved. It is useful to accept that in terms of understanding technology research and development needed and deployment processes, the private sector is always ahead of the government. So, well, the purpose of this trust mark is basically to be able to give an incentive for these online sellers, so that it's signaling to the buyers that this seller has already gone through the vetting process, I guess, of the DTI, and it's shown that they've had a very sterling record of conducting transactions online, and they've always shown like a record of compliance with the code of conduct. So it's really a signal to the buyers that this organization or this seller has a very sterling track record with regards to e-commerce. And I think it's something that can help also invigorate the online selling, because by seeing the trust mark and by having our online sellers work towards achieving this trust mark, we can provide the buyers with good signaling when it comes to with regards to which sellers they can really rely on.
So this will be applied for individually, Mr. President, by the e-sellers, e-retailers, Mr. President.
Yes.
How about can the platform also get this trust mark, and then we will trust everything in the platform already?
Yes, even the platform can get this trust mark. Again, it speaks to the compliance of the platform, whether it be e-marketplace or whether it be a direct store. It speaks to their compliance with the responsibilities as defined by the law. So if the DTA finds that if they apply for this trust mark and the DTA finds that they've had a exemplary record with regards to their responsibilities, then they can be issued a trust mark, which also signals to the buyer that this company or this seller has a very good record with regards to selling, and it only adds to their, I guess it only adds to their recognition and trustworthiness.
So is Shopee a good example of an e-marketplace, Mr. President? Tama, Shopee po. When we're talking about online platforms and e-marketplace, Shopee is an example. Tama po ba yun?
Yeah, I think Shopee, Lazada,
Lazada and then
they're-
others. Okay.
they're good. They're examples
Yes,
of.
thank you.
Yes.
And then, for example, in Shopee, how many vendors are there in Shopee? And then in Lazada, siguro 100,000 siguro po yan, Mr. President.
100 only?
1,000.
300,000. In Shopee, about 300,000. In Lazada, about 500,000 merchants.
Wow, kaya nga, so let me just give a word of caution to the DTI when we issue a trust mark to platforms, Mr. President. Don't tell me na examine nyo po yung 300,000 na yun or yung 500,000 individually. And then do not tell me that we will rely on the certification of Shopee or Lazada that they have also individually examined the 300,000 or 500,000. Kasi ngayon, we get that impression na ganun eh. Right now, we get that impression that, I think meron pa yatang nasa scam na kahit na nandun na sa kanilang certified mall eh, or certified para trusted marketplace, meron pa rin po nasa scam na mga e-buyers eh. So just a word of caution, Mr. President, na when we issue this trust mark, well, let's really examine that person applying or entity applying for the trust mark, and mahirap siguro to give this to a platform or a marketplace where there are 500,000 vendors, Mr. President.
Yes, your point is well taken regarding the trust mark, Your Honor, and your point is well taken. The extent to which they have online business is quite large, so being able to vet them would be a very challenging task.
So ano po ba itong trust mark, Mr. President? When you visit the web page or the site, we will see a certain logo, Mr. President.
Yeah, of course, with regards to the designs, of course, these things will follow. But basically, the concept is, a seal of excellence, a logo that can be posted, similar to what government gives to, maybe LGU, a seal of approval that they earn and that they regularly assess. This is not a one-time, forever trust
okay.
mark. It is something that regularly is vetted, regularly is checked to make sure that they're in compliance.
Yes, because kung maraming reklamo, siyempre that will be taken into account. But this is a digital file, Mr. President. So isn't this easy to fake, Mr. President?
Well, obviously, if the DTI sees that there are these fakes that they're faking a seal, they do have. That's why it's important. I think that this law is passed. Is they have teeth now, which is they can blacklist, they can take down the site. So I think that takedown provision, which they do not have now, is very critical. So it gives them the ability to really enforce the responsibilities of both the sellers.
So thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Sponsor, for bringing this concept of the takedown power, bringing this up. So who has this power to take down a website, a platform? What is the extent of the takedown power, and what are the reasons that this decision maker or this entity is authorized now to issue a takedown order? And who will enforce it, Mr. President?
Yes, the power will reside with the Secretary of the Department of Trade and Industry to take down for 30 days the site or the content that is under question, and whoever the seller has 48 hours to reply.
Seller.
So that will be the process.
So since the word seller was mentioned, so this is a takedown of a specific web page or site, Mr. President?
Yes, yes. It
This
says
is the-
here, yeah, it's in section 18, by its own
Yes.
initiative or upon petition of an online consumer or another concerned party, the online sale of goods, services, or digital product is violative of this act and Consumer Act of the Philippines or any other related laws. The DTI Secretary, to abate any further violations, shall, after due notice and hearing, have the power to issue an order directing the content or listing on a web page or social media post be taken down, made inaccessible in the Philippines, or otherwise be rendered commercially inoperative to abate any further violations.
And the sponsor mentioned violations. So what would be the violations which could lead to a takedown order? Kasi parang extreme yata itong takedown order. Pero I agree with this kasi talagang ibig sabihin nun, we do not want Filipino consumers or Philippine-based consumers using their computers from accessing a particular site or web page because of there must be serious violations of law, Mr. President. So,
Yes.
kasama ba rito, kunyari, accessible yung mga items, medical items, or food and drug items, cosmetic items na hindi registered ng FDA? Is that a possible
Yes, actually, it's
sanction, Mr. President?
yes, Your Honor, it's specified in the law actually when which conditions need to be present. It says here that provided that, and I quote, provided that the DTI Secretary may immediately issue a provisional takedown order to prevent grave and irreparable injury to the public when the following conditions are present. A, when the DTI Secretary finds that a good, service, or digital product is imminently injurious, unsafe, or dangerous. Or B, when the seller under investigation has been previously penalized under this section.
So
those are-
kasama, yes sir, you were reading, Mr. Sponsor, from page 13, no? Line
Yes,
10,
yes,
line
ye-
10, ano?
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
line 10 po yung
Yes, Your
paragraph A. So kasama po nga dito yung sinabi ko po na kasi isa yan sa mga reklamo, yung mga accessible, yung mga supposed to be with items which need FDA certificate of product registration.
Yes, Your Honor, that was included in this.
So yan,
Yes,
yan po yung pasok sila sa
provision. Yes,
product which is imminently injurious, unsafe, or dangerous.
yes, yes, sir.
Ano pa po pwede pang ano rito? Yung mga contraband, saan natin ano yun? Kasi iba naman yung usapan ng contraband. Let us say, baril, ano pa ba ibang contrabands? And then, mga drugs or mga, ano pa ba mga,
I think,
mga
yes.
fake counterfeit
I think
items,
in
Mr.
some,
President.
yes, the definition encompasses a lot of products because when you say dangerous, when you say contraband, whether it's drugs, weapons, or that, it's imminently injurious.
But the fake ones, Mr. President.
The fakes,
Fake.
well, economically, it's,
Pero-
I would say, maybe we can
Yeah,
define it
maybe
further.
Maybe we can, at the proper time, siguro amend and expand the language so that kung ano yung what we are experiencing today, we make sure that they are covered, Mr. President, for
But-
the.
Yes, Your Honor, just to note, there's also prohibited products that are not, I mean, if they're selling prohibited products, obviously, that's not also allowed. That's also a grounds for a takedown, if it's under the law prohibited. So if they're selling, prohibited items that are prohibited by the law, and I was furnished with a list. It's quite extensive. So if Your Honor would like, we can submit to your office this list of prohibited and restricted items.
But as written, as the section is currently written, are we sure that all of those items which you want to be covered are covered? So maybe we need to amend the language here, Mr. President, because as of the moment, we're limiting it to imminently injurious, unsafe, or dangerous products when it comes to the products or the good or the service.
Yes, Your Honor, that's a very good point, I think. And of course, we're open to that, to being more specific with what products and maybe specifically detailing which prohibited items are not allowed. So maybe
Sa real life.
perhaps we can improve on the wording of this. We're open to any suggestions on improving the wording of these provisions, Your Honor?
Thank you for that manifestation, Mr. President. Uh, we are creating is the e-commerce bureau a new bureau to be created under this law, or there is already an existing one which will just be improved or expanded, Mr. President? Ngayon sa DTI, meron na bang e-commerce sa DTI?
It's an existing created 2-3 years ago, but it's composed of 11 people, so it's not. So it's a very small office that we really need to upgrade in order to service the demand, the growing needs of the online marketplace.
So, the DTI already has an e-commerce bureau right now with 11 personnel. And if this bill becomes a law, how are we going to strengthen the office, and are we now changing also the tasks and responsibilities of the office, the objectives also of the office, Mr. President?
Yes, right now it's just it's a division. So with the passing of the law, it becomes a large bureau. And
okay,
I think
division.
that's and headed by a director. So yeah, there's more. There's a expansion of this e-commerce bureau that is much needed under that is provided for in the law.
Thank you.
Currently an ad hoc office.
Right now, it's an ad hoc office.
Right now, Mr. President, our e-commerce division, tama yun yata, was put up 2 years ago. For what purpose, Mr. President?
Yes, it was created to handle the e-commerce industry 2 years ago. But
And to handle means what, Mr. President?
yes, this was under the directions of former Secretary Ramon Lopez. The division was mobilized, the private e-sector commerce, and developed this in order to handle the e-commerce sector. So I guess this gives it a more defined. It increases the size of the e-commerce bureau, and it really defines its functions, and it also defines its powers and responsibilities. Right
So-
now, it's not defined in the law. It's not defined in the law. It's a small division that was created ad hoc to handle the e-commerce, but obviously the needs for the e-commerce now are much larger and require more support.
So right now, the e-commerce division does not entertain complaints, Mr. President?
No, it does not.
Does not.
It does not entertain complaints.
It does not, okay.
Yeah, it's only composed of 11 plantilla positions and will focus on the implementation of e-commerce policies, programs, and projects to promote and develop the e-commerce sector.
Siguro itong bill is one of their products, one of their outputs. Tama po? The idea, the idea of
The idea, yes, of course, this was
okay.
also we're working with the Department of Trade and Industry with this to craft this bill.
So when the division becomes a bureau, now to be called e-commerce bureau, this will now entertain complaints. And can we say now that this e-commerce bureau is going to perform quasi-judicial functions, Mr. President, in the sense that it is adjudicating now the rights and duties between and among parties, Mr. President?
Consumer will remain with consumer protection.
Tama ba yun? Tama ba yun? Meaning ng quasi-judicial?
So yes, it is a quasi-judicial body, and it has some administrative powers to resolve issues and to administer fines, administrative penalties.
Contemporized violation naman sa bilang. Direct contempt.
Contest hours.
And here, with regards to the powers, the ITA grants the director subpoena powers, and the functions of the Bureau entail the following enforcement activities: coordinate with, compel, or petition, whenever appropriate, any entity, government agency to take action on any matter that may impede e-commerce, investigate motu proprio, and file the appropriate cases for violation of any provision of this act, and intervene or participate in a manner as may be appropriate in cases initiated or pending with other regulatory agencies involving e-commerce or violations of any provision of this act.
May we know what section and page,
This is
Number-
according to section 8.
what was the sponsor reading, Mr. President? What section?
This is according to section 8.
8? Section. Okay. So, Mr. President, Section 14 gives the director of the Bureau the power to issue summons, subpoena, and then the failure to comply will amount to indirect contempt, Mr. President. When failure to comply with the subpoena. But then, how about the failure to abide and to comply with the orders and decisions of the Bureau, Mr. President?
Oh, sorry, Your Honor, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Section 14 is,
Yes,
gives the Bureau the power to issue, the director of the Bureau, the power to issue subpoena, summons, to initiate the investigation.
Yes, yes.
But being a quasi-judicial body now, it will now adjudicate or render a decision on the rights of the complaining party vis-a-vis the respondent or the defendant, etc. So there will now be a ruling, Mr. President.
Yes, that's correct.
Failure to how will the ruling be enforced, Mr. President? In-execute ba ito, parang court order, Mr. President? Especially if it's a sum of money, let us say, in favor of the complaining party? Ano ba? Parang korte ba? May sheriff ba ito? Hindi, parang compliance orders na answer to the question. Sino ba mag-decide? Si e-commerce bureau? One person.
Yes, they can, well, again, they do have the powers, as I mentioned earlier, to compel the online sellers should they not follow the responsibilities that they were given under the act. So what are the powers of the e-commerce bureau? They are the ability to blacklist, the power to blacklist, the takedown power, as mentioned earlier, as we discussed, and the power to. They have also power of contempt. They can file contempt, and they also have the power to levy administrative fines.
I'm going over Section 8, Mr. President, on the functions of the e-commerce bureau. Where is it specifically stated that the e-commerce bureau will act on the complaint and adjudicate on the rights, extent of the rights of the complaining party as well as the respondent, Mr. President?
Is it specified?
Which should be the BBI, not necessarily the e-commerce.
Chapter 2. Is this the? It says here in section 8 of chapter 2, letter E.
Letter E.
Part of the functions is receive business and consumer complaints on internet transactions and facilitate the speedy resolution thereof by the appropriate government agency which has jurisdiction over the concern. And letter G also which says investigate motu proprio and file the appropriate cases for violations of any provision in this act.
Yes, that is what worries me, Mr. President. Baka we may be over-promising here because letter E, parang the e-commerce bureau under Section 8, paragraph E, will actually will refer refer the consumer complaints to the appropriate government agency and make sure that there is a speedy resolution of the complaint. So, hindi pa rin siya. And then letter G is about criminal violations of, penal violations of this act, Mr. President. So, ang hinahanap ko yung remedy kasi ni ang remedy nung e-purchaser, who is the complainant or a victim of a scam or a fraud, Mr. President. Sana mapabilis yung action sa kanyang reklamo, because that's the only way we will improve the trust in e-commerce and e-transactions if mabilis po ang aksyon sa reklamo. And itong letter E po, section 8, letter E, hindi si e-commerce bureau ang nagde-decide parang because it mentions appropriate government agency which has jurisdiction over the concern, Mr. President. So wala pala.
Yes, I suppose there are some, I suppose there are some, because under the law, there are certain laws that they could file. They have certain liabilities outside of what is in this law. There are other laws that have certain criminal or even some have even criminal liabilities that they can also address in regular courts. But again, I guess this e-commerce bureau provides a more it gives more consumer protection, and it has some penalties, and it has certain powers to exercise discipline on the businesses that commit these infractions. But they also can address. But of course, if there are other complaints that might be of a different nature that are also where existing laws are being
Ano ulit yung meaning?
are being our existing laws are being
Okay. So
broken, then they can also go to the DTI, and the DTI can also file or help them file with the necessary file cases if need be with the necessary agencies or courts as needed.
So, Mr. President, it all depends on what we want the e-commerce bureau to achieve, Mr. President. So,
It's an infraction.
do we want the e-commerce bureau to resolve actual consumer complaints, Mr. President, arising out
think-
of
Yeah.
e-commerce transactions?
Yes, similar to what they do now. If there's consumer complaints, they're being addressed by the DTI.
Yes.
Under this law, the e-commerce bureau will be assigned to address these complaints. Nevertheless, it doesn't preclude them from filing if should there be other infractions of the law that are being committed. Of course, they can also refer them to other agencies depending on what that infraction is. So it doesn't preclude them from filing any other filing cases for any infraction of the law. In fact, the DTI will assist them in that. But with regards to the consumer aspect of it, where maybe with regards to like the specific instances as provided for by the law, the e-commerce bureau has certain powers and has certain powers that it can utilize to address these consumer concerns. Not to say that it doesn't preclude them from filing any other in filing any other concerns with other agencies that it may apply to.
Yes, right now, Mr. President, if there is a non-digital consumer complaint, the complaining party can run to the DTI, di ba? Because and what bureau or division will entertain the complaining party, Mr. President?
I suppose from my understanding, of course, with consumer complaints, that's only one type of complaint. But I understand that there might be complaints that might be referred to the courts,
Yes.
or that might be referred to other agencies. I'm just trying to think of other circumstances, but I'm sure it could be products that might be illegal by nature. They can report it to the maybe the
Yes, Mr.
PDR,
President.
yeah.
Can we focus on the consumer lang,
Yes,
consumer
yes.
first? Okay. Right now, let us say in a non-digital transaction, the consumer has a complaint. O parang ako, pagbili ng gatas, Mr. President, nagsuka yung anak ko, sunod-sunod na suka, nagkalagnat pa. So,
This is now existing.
I run to the DTI to file a complaint and it is entertained. It is entertained by what division or bureau in the DTI currently, Mr. President?
Yes, consumer complaints are lodged with the Fair Trade
Fair,
Enforcement Bureau of the DTI.
Fair Trade Enforcement Bureau. And that is made possible by a certain law, maybe the Consumer Act of the Philippines, Mr. President.
That's correct, the
That's
Consumer
correct.
Act.
Okay, so ganon. And we want the e-commerce bureau to perform that specific function of that existing bureau for non-digital transactions. So, and yet I cannot find in Section 8 a specific grant of power for the e-commerce bureau to resolve this actual consumer complaint arising out of an e-commerce transaction. So, if the sponsor agrees with me that we may have omitted this, then at the proper time we can make this very explicit, Mr. President,
Yes,
and pattern it after the Consumer Act of the Philippines, Mr. President.
Yes, Your Honor, your point is well taken, and we are we are open to any suggestions that might clarify the language
Yeah.
of the bill. I think that's a very good point, and we are open to that.
Kasi yes, the only reason why I'm really focusing on the consumer, Mr. President, is talaga marami reklamo ngayon. Marami talaga reklamo. And these e-marketplaces are supposed to be high-tech already, Mr. President. Pero yun na nga, siguro, it's really impossible. 300,000, 500,000 vendors, and not all are, anong tawag mo doon? Consensus or with good motive. Some are ill-motivated participants in e-commerce, Mr. President. So that is the order and discipline which I hope this bill will bring to the market, Mr. President.
Yes, Your Honor, and we thank you for that help in crafting a bill that will be responsive to these needs. Of course, there are certain aspects of it that can be improved upon, and we're very open to listen to any amendments that might clarify the provisions in the bill.
So at this point, Mr. President, I hope the sponsor will allow this representation to suspend this interpellation, Mr. President, and not surprise me with a negative answer, Mr. President. Because I need, in all honesty, we need time to.
Yes, Your Honor.
Bill, Mr. President.
Of course,
Is that okay with you?
yes.
So,
We are open to you suspend. Of course, we are very open to that, Your Honor.
Anyway, Mr. President, we will continue where we ended, Mr. President, and not repeat the entire thing again.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Pimentel, Senator Villar. Mr. President, at this juncture, I move that we suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 1846. I so move, Mr. President.
Is there objection? Hearing none, consideration of the said measure is hereby suspended.
May I move for a minute suspension, Mr. President?
Session suspended.